meant to say it in prayer, but I'll say it out loud. And just thank you, Lord, for restoring Lila to her. Great to have you. It's been a long journey, but you're here tonight with us. Lesson 10. I know that you'd like to have one of those, wouldn't you, Lila? You got lesson. Someone gave it out. Okay. Did anybody need last week's lesson? We missed your lovely voice, sir. For the harvester.
Nobody's here or not. What happened last year?
Yeah, we got it done.
Oh, you grabbed it already. Okay. And
I was here last week.
yeah.
Yeah, I need this week's lesson.
Oh, you didn't get this week's one.
No, I was there.
Anyone else came in after and didn't get tonight? What's that?
Oh, I was just saying.
Oh,
Trying to figure out if I was here. I can't remember.
And I wasn't here, so I
She just
can't
told me it was good. You might have got here or not.
I believe you were here.
Is that here? Okay. Body.
Body.
Here.
Yeah.
Here.
You were not forgot your mind.
Yes.
Well, as I promised, we're not going slowly like we did through the book of Ephesians, although that I'm not apologizing for that. I think we purposely did that, but in this book we're moving through a lot quicker, and we're in chapter 5, and we're about halfway through. And trying to do, one thing I will say, and trying to do a complete chapter in one night is a taxing thing, and so often I depend on you to read the notes afterwards, because I don't try to cover everything that I do in the lesson, because it's just maybe keep you here too long. But the notes are complete on each chapter, even if the lesson doesn't get all the way through. So you can break the book of Daniel down a little bit into two parts. The historical part of the narrative, the story of Daniel and Israel's dispersion into Babylon captivity, that's 70 years. And so the book of Daniel records that, a lot of it. Much of the book of Daniel is about Daniel, but it's also about other characters such as Nebuchadnezzar. And so there's the historical part. And the first few chapters are really more, except for chapter 2, are more about the history. And next chapter, with Daniel in the lion's den, is the last of the sort of history story type chapters. After that, so basically in the new year, we're going to be getting into more of the prophetic side of Daniel. Although, as you've seen all the way through, there's been prophecy all of the way through, because the book itself is prophetic, and Nebuchadnezzar is certainly a type of that spirit of Antichrist that's in our world today. I was thinking of showing you a movie tonight for 15 minutes, but I hesitated because I felt that it would just grab too much of our time. But in the new year, I'll show it to you. But I referenced this a few weeks ago, but I actually found a television news report that documents what's going on in China right now with the surveillance society, and how we get a credit rating based on how we deal with our debt, Theirs is called Social Credit, not to be confused with the old Social Credit Party of Canada, but if they're being monitored all the time in their society by cameras, by listening devices, by their telephones are tapped, as are ours. You may not be aware of this, but you can actually, even when you're not on your phone can be active, can be used, not necessarily all the time, but phones, anything like that that has a microphone in it and a camera in it can be turned on if someone wishes to, that's got the technology and the ability to do it. But this really is a really good report, because what they do is go into the fact that they're using convenience. It goes on and talks about Sweden, and I've talked about Sweden, and also talks about the devices they're now putting under your skin, and there's a state in the United States that's trying it out now again, because when they did it before, a few years ago, there was some problems with infection. It's about the size of a piece of rice. It fits in between your thumb and your finger here, and there's a company in the United States that's doing it now. It's a bit of a gimmick, but because they're only using it they're using it, instead of using a key, you just walk up to the building and tap and the door opens, and you can buy pop at the pop machine and things like that. But they're also using it to demonstrate the technology that's available. But you put that together with a state that decides that you should have credit or you shouldn't have credit based on your morality or what you believe or what you say you believe, and then you get exactly what the Bible is talking about. And it's interesting, because as I was watching the program, they actually referred to the book of Revelation. So people are seeing how society is moving in a way. So what we're studying is very relevant to the world we live in. And technology is catching up to what the Bible taught so many years ago. So I think we're in for some exciting times in the new year as we get into the prophetic side. And one of the words we use, and it was so nice of you to bring up the chalk, nice to have a chalkboard, but I thought I would use it. And the glory of the Lord shone round about them. Amen. This is a word I want to bring back from our days in Hebrews. Precision. Because God is extremely precise. And there is a day already appointed when Jesus is going to return. He's not wondering, well, I wonder when we should get around to that, or, then we'll get to that point, or when humans will bring it to that point. It's already determined. And God doesn't live sort of like we do, like from one day to the next to the next. He's not moving into the future. Future's already right there in him. So he's already seen everything is precise with him. And as we studied the book of Daniel and we get into some of the things that are going to happen, we are going to see the amazing mathematical precision of time as God can do. The only way that you could be as precise as the book of Daniel is if you were God and wrote it. Couldn't be written by a man. So tonight's lesson is centered around, we've moved in time. Last week, if you weren't with us, we talked about King Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, the chapter 4 is actually co-written by King Nebuchadnezzar. It's his personal testimony of how he was stricken by God. On page 4, I have a picture of him. It's an artist's conception of what he may have looked like at the point when he was on all fours. Pretty ugly beast that he had become. Imagine the man who was the most powerful man in the world, stricken with this horrible mental illness that had caused him to be on all fours and have all his nails grow out and his hair grow out and live on grass like an ox and just be completely set aside. And then one day God just says, okay, you're restored, and he gets up and dresses and gets cleaned up and goes back in and is restored not only to his sanity, but he's restored to his court and restored to his authority and restored to his place. Only God could do that, but it just shows you, if you think about it, you let your mind get around it, how much is God in control? Or can I put it in against the negative backdrop and say, how much is man in control? If you can be out of your country, out of your mind, out of control for that many years, and then God just snap his fingers and you walk back in and everybody has allowed you back in. And only God could do that. It's not natural, it's not normal. If a leader in our country was stricken for 8 months and considered mentally ill, the chance of them returning back into a position of leadership is nil. And so for this to happen is just amazing. So it was God. But God was teaching him a lesson. God was showing him that it wasn't about him. It's not about man. It's about God. God's in control. He was only there because God had put him there. He wasn't there because he was the biggest, the brightest, the smartest, the survival of the fittest, so to speak. He was there because God had placed him there. So we saw that, and now what we're doing is moving on beyond Nebuchadnezzar. Now, rather than me tell this part, I'm just going to let you tell me this part so that I'll know that we remember way back to chapter 2. But what was the vision or the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had that bothered him so much in chapter 2? What did he see that Daniel prayed and saw and then told him about? Just not necessarily the interpretation of it, but what did he see? A statue, right? Okay. So, a statue, it was a person with a head of gold. And then a chest, and arms. As you can see, this is one of my better gifts, bronze. It was made out of what? Silver. And then what was the next part? Belly area, which was bronze. And then the legs. And feet. There's 10 there if you count them closely. Look closely. Iron, and then breaking down to iron and clay. Baked clay, thank you. So that was the statue that was so horrifying. You can see if you saw that in a dream how scary it would be. But he has this dream, and then Daniel tells him, okay, so this statue you saw was from God, and God is showing you history. He's rolling out history for you, and you, sir, are that head of gold. After you will come another kingdom, and it is silver. Another kingdom which will rule over the entire world is bronze, and then followed by a kingdom which will come from there of iron, and that kingdom will not come to an end like these kingdoms, but end up dividing and mixing with clay, baked clay. And then a rock will be cut from a mountain without human hands and swing into the feet and just destroy the whole thing. and then the rock will fill up the entire earth. And he interprets that. So we didn't spend a lot of time on this because later on in January we are going to go into another chapter that's going to break this down for us, and we'll get into it in a very in-depth way of all of these kingdoms and how they fulfill in another vision that Daniel has, where Daniel sees these kingdoms displayed in a different way. But tonight I wanted to bring this up because what we are seeing tonight is the end of the head. This is the last time that we'll be dealing with the head of gold, because during the time between chapter 4, which we were on last week, and chapter 5 this week, Nebuchadnezzar dies. Nebuchadnezzar stops living on the earth, and Babylon continues on. So something he is part of, something he didn't start. Babylon's been around a long time. We said that it started with Nimrod back in the time of the Tower of Babel. Then it had gone down and risen up and gone down. But what Nebuchadnezzar rules over is what we call Neo or New Babylon, that was started by Hammurabi back around 1200 BC. And then if you look at the chart on page 5, it kind of gives you a breakdown of these kings. So you have Hammurabi around 1200. He was the first Babylonian king, and you may have heard of the Code of Hammurabi, and it still exists today. It's an obelisk with all of these codes of conduct on it and how to do business, and very parallel to some of the laws that were given to the Israelites. And so then there's this period of decline, and then somewheres in the middle, about 600 years later, you have this, what they call the Neo-Babylonian period, this New Babylon that is the head of gold that Nebuchadnezzar saw. It was started by his father, Nebuchadnezzar, and he, I'm kind of reviewing here, but he oversees the entire Mesopotamia area and goes up into Syria, Lebanon, down into Israel, right down, touching into Egypt, and controls that entire area from Mesopotamia all through the Middle East. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar inherits. So Nebuchadnezzar then begins to build up this city. So when we use the term Babylon, we're referring to two things. The city itself, the city Babylonia, the city of Babylon, and the Babylonian Empire. So it's kind of like saying New York. When I say New York, you think of the city. But New York City is really New York City, which is part of the state of New York, which is much greater. And so Babylon is not just the city of Babylon, it's an entire region that's controlled from the city of Babylon, which is its capital. Follow that? Now, the city of Babylon was considered the greatest city of its day. It was larger than Rome, which came later. It was more protected, more defended than Rome would have been defended. I have some pictures that we'll get into in a few minutes here. And a bit of this is repetitious because we talked about this earlier, but this is a chapter where we're kind of tipping from the first to the last, and so we're going to review a bit so we can go forward. Under Nebuchadnezzar, that was expanded. Nebuchadnezzar inherited it, And Nebuchadnezzar led raids when his father was king. He was co-regent with him. And we know that it was during his second year as co-reigning with his father. His father's still alive, but he's considered a king or a prince. That's when he does a second raid on Israel. And that's right around the year 600, give or take a year or two, is when he comes to Jerusalem, and they lay siege to the walls of Jerusalem. They go over the top, just like was prophesied. They defeat the king, because this king has turned away from God and turned toward idols and gotten rid of the truth. And whenever a nation, doesn't matter if it's a Jewish nation or a nation that's not Jewish but is a Gentile nation, turns away from God, God turns away from them, and protection is taken off, and they are subdued by their enemies. And they either implode from within or are attacked. And Israel is attacked, and they are taken away. The best of Israel is taken away. Its royal family is taken away. Daniel and his 3 friends are part of the royal family, the royal aristocracy of Israel, the best, the elite, and they are taken with many other people, who some of them to be slaves, but they're taken back to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, so that they can be trained and maybe reinstalled back in Jerusalem as puppets or whatever, leaders. And we know that happens around the year 600. And so that whole period of captivity. Do you remember the song By the Rivers of Babylon? Taken from the Psalm, and that's this lament of the Jewish people have, that they're not in their home country, but they're in exile in Babylon. And that period of time lasts 70 years. Another neat number, how God is precise. 70 years, God leaves them there. And that's basically the life of Daniel. Daniel spends his entire life from the time of his exile into Babylon, remaining faithful to God, but he spends most of his life as a promoted government leader, bureaucrat in the Babylonian capital of Babylon, working first for the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, but as we'll see tonight, a switch is going to come. There's going to be a change in government. It's not like the conservatives are overthrown by the liberals. It's a complete overthrow of one country's leadership by another country. And so what we have is the beheading of the statue tonight, and the head of gold is done, and the chest of silver begins tonight in our story. And it happens that precisely, that quickly. It happens in one night. Isn't that crazy? A city that's so fortified, more fortified than any other city. They were set up, they had enough grain in the city and enough ability in the city to live there for a year. They thought, well, they could come and lay siege, because that's the typical way that generals did it. You know, they'd surround the city and they say, well, great, you're in there. Fine, we're not going to be able to get in, but you're not going to be able to get out. So you'll eventually die in famine and sickness, and eventually cannibalism would happen, and the people would just eventually either succumb, or they would open the gates and let them in, saying, well, it's better to be overthrown than to live like we're living. But what happens here is in one night, without ladders, without attack, through the gates, the city's overthrown. And again, who could do that but God? And this isn't only documented in the Bible, it's documented in history by the writings of the leaders of the Medo-Persian Empire and how they took Rome. how they took Babylon. So, going back then, I jumped ahead to say tonight's chapter. So, in between last week, when Nebuchadnezzar has his insane time, and then is restored to, in chapter 4, to chapter 5, a period of time passes by. During that time, Nebuchadnezzar dies in about 562 BC. So if you're going backwards in time, about 50 years after he first came to Israel and brought Daniel forward, he's dead. And a new leader begins, and he has a wonderful name. His wonderful name is Evil Merodach. Long live the king, right? What a great name. I don't know why his mother would call him that, but I don't know if that is his nickname or that was a name that came to be known as, but that was his. And there are other children involved, as there always was, you know, and if you follow the story of David, there were many wives. Solomon, there were many wives, and there's many children, and then there's disputes of who. So that we could get into all of that, but there's no sense of getting into all of that confusion. We're going to just stay sort of on the leaders. So Evil Merodach inherits the throne, and he only reigns for about 6 years. And he's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. In 2 Kings, he's mentioned that he releases Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, out of prison, and he's allowed to go back to Jerusalem, because remember, the prophecy is that one day Israel will be restored and the temple will be restored. It's sort of like the period we're in now, where we're saying one day there's going to be a new temple and Jesus is going to be the ruler of, there will be somebody of the lineage of David. He's going to rule over that temple, right? Well, we're kind of in the same period of time that they were in then, because the temple had been destroyed, had been looted, and they're looking for someone to come and who's going to save them. And Daniel keeps praying for the release of the people of Israel back into their own land again. And so during this period of time, there's all this prayer going on. And you know the book of Esther, right? Well, as we get into the next few chapters, Esther's going to take a role in this, because Esther actually gets involved with the king who's part of this silver kingdom. And so she plays a role in all of this. So it starts to all kind of fit together. The puzzle will come together for you. So this Merodach rules and reigns in between chapters 4 and 5 of Daniel. Everybody follow me what I'm saying here? Then there's actually what happens is that there's a man by the name of Nabonidus. I don't think I'm saying that the way he would have. What is it? Thank you. You say that so well. Do you want to say it one more time? Nabonidus. Okay, thank you. He is really the king, and he spends much of his time because remember, Babylon is in decline. The head is reeling here, and the Medes and Persians, which is modern day Iran and some of Syria, they are becoming stronger, and they're raiding deeper into Babylonian territory. And so Nabonidus is out fighting, and he's taking the battle outside of the city of Babylon, out to the outer edges of the empire, trying to control things as the empire begins to shrink, and more of the area is being controlled by the Medo-Persians who are coming stronger. And there are different leaders under the name of the lineage of Cyrus who are becoming more and more powerful. And so Nabonidus is out fighting, and he leaves in charge his co-regent, or someone who's part of his family, who's sharing the kingship with him, and his name is Belshazzar, and that's what the story in chapter 5 is about this man who is staying at home and looking after the fort, if you will. Well, Nabonidus is out fighting. Is everybody sort of following that? How you could have two leaders? And that's how it is. One is the military leader and really the leader of Babylon, and this other man is sort of looking after things back home. They're the sons, they're co-regents, but the sad thing is that Belshazzar is kind of like your fourth generation rich kid. Everything's been handed down. He's what's that word? Feeling entitled. He's got all the riches. He's got everything he wants, and he's not too serious about seeing everything crumble. And he's letting his brother do all the fighting and so on. And so we have this image that takes place. Chapter 5 all takes place on one night. Chapter 5 takes place in one evening, and it takes place when Belshazzar is having a party. He throws a party. Now, the chapter's rather long. I'm trusting that you're reading the chapters as we go along, so again, like we did last week, I'm not going to try and read the entire chapter, but as the chapter starts, Belshazzar is having a great banquet for 1,000 nobles who drank wine with him. So, what's that sound like? A major party. And I was reading in a history book, is that exaggeratory to say 1,000 nobles? And it says it's not, that it was not irregular for them to have a huge gathering and recognize many wealthy people. So it's much like some of the countries today that I've been in, which we would call developing countries. There's no middle class. They're either very, very, very wealthy, who have all the money and they're controlling everything, and there's just opulence beyond anything that you could ever imagine here in Canada, and then there's the very poor. And the very poor live next door. I lived there and saw in Asia where, you'd have a home and they would have everything you could imagine. They'd have a gardener and a cook and several different people to do. Well, they just never had to do a thing. And they would have drivers. And they'd say, you take the driver out. And they just lived like that. And they would have their houses would be walled, protected because of the terrible people who lived outside, the poor. And they would have, and of course, the people were very poor, and so they would see the wealthy as somebody to attack, perhaps. But they would have either broken glass on the top of the walls, so that if someone tried to crawl over, they just get all cut to pieces, or wired fences, or different things. They'd have guards. They'd have paid guards. And that's how much of the world, if you go outside of North America, that's how much of the world lives today, is in a society where that's the reality. And in El Salvador, that's the way it was. If you were there in Haiti, that's the way it is. You have oligarchs who are, there are people in Haiti that are richer than you could ever imagine of being richer. And they control the government. They control everything. And then there's the very, very poor. That's just the way it is. And I saw in one home that I used to visit, and they had people who they knew very well, like they had grown up themselves inside their walls. and they had this family that grew up outside the walls and had their lean-to there, and they would take out their garbage and give it to them to eat. And they had sort of strange relationship where, you know, they had grown up together and they always ate their garbage. That's the way they'd never think of making their life better. They just thought they were doing wonderful to feed them like that, you know. It was just this weird relationship. And so this is the way it was in those countries. You had your people who were the ruling class, and they lived in a whole different world, gold bricks and just everything to perfection with all kinds of slaves, and then the very, very poor that built those buildings, that made the bricks. And if they didn't make the bricks, they were whipped. It's easy to have an economy where you don't have to pay the people who are working, right? You can make a lot of money that way. Sadly, that's the way that much of our world has run. So if you go to the next page, and I'm sorry if you're not a historical like history's not your thing, because tonight might be a little bit like that, I'm sorry. But I'm just trying to put everything in perspective using these charts. This is the 70 years that Israel was in Babylon captivity, from 605 to 536. And why were they there? Because they had forsaken the Lord, they had forsaken the Sabbath, they had, and so God had warned them through Jeremiah the prophet, through Isaiah. He said, you have ignored the Sabbath, and so God brought on the penalty of 70-year captivity, which is 70 Sabbath weeks, and so we are seeing that happen. And you have this period of time that Israel is in captivity in Babylon. Now, I had nice little arrows, but when we tried to print Word, the arrows fell down. And they're down here on the bottom of page 6, and they don't make any sense. So you see arrows down there, just ignore them. They're supposed to be up there. I apologize. Anyway, if you look at on the chart that you have in front of you, do you see, and I'll hold it up, maybe that'll help. You see the blue line here? Not the black line at the top, but the blue line on the chart. You see the blue line? Okay, so if you see the blue line on the chart, you'll see first, second, and third. Does everybody see that? The black that says first, second, and third. Those are the raids that were made by Nebuchadnezzar when he raided Jerusalem. And it was on that second raid in 598 BC that he overtook Jerusalem, and that's when Daniel would have gone to Babylon. So then it is, if you look along the edge of the blue at the bottom, you'll see an arrow that says 538. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
And it says Babylon falls to Persia. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
That is where we are tonight. So we started in 598, and all of these chapters we've been talking about happened between 598 and the death of Nebuchadnezzar. And now we've jumped way down, and tonight we're at 538 BC. So we've moved into the future by nearly 70 years. And so Israel isn't released back into Israel yet, but this is the end of the head. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Am I making sense? Good. That's great. I'm very confident when I'm preaching about Jesus and saying, you know, things like that. But when we get into the history, I'm less confident. So I just need to make sure that I know that you're understanding me. Okay, so that chart, unfortunately, without the arrows, but I think I've used enough to show you. Now, the next thing I want to show you is that during one of the reasons that he could throw this party, even though he knew he was at war. Now, I've never lived when Canada's been, I've been alive when Canada's been at war, say, in Afghanistan or Iraq, but there was no way at that time that anything was coming back here, I mean, other than our wounded, but everything was happening in that theater. It wasn't happening here. We weren't, but I've heard from my parents and from aunts and uncles of times in Nova Scotia where I grew up where the war, the U-boats were from Germany were close to the shores of Nova Scotia, and they had to put, and I'm sure it was the same in Newfoundland, they had to put coverings over the windows at night so that they couldn't be seen, and I mean, there was that fear of attack. People lived under that fear of attack even in North America, especially after the United States went to war, and so then the U-boats were coming further and closer to our coast, and of course there was the sinking of our ships. Wasn't the ferry between Breton and Port-au-Basque was sunk, wasn't it? Yeah. So I mean, there was that fear that any time we could come under attack, and so you would think that if you were at war the way these people are at war, there would be that fear in the capital. They wouldn't be having a party. But this bottom picture will show you just how comfortable they thought they were, how protected they were. If you look at the picture, you'll see three sections, a triple wall. So you have, if you look at the very right side of the picture, I'm looking at the picture on the bottom of page 6. See the little ships? They're on the River Tigris, and then there's a wall there, and then sort of an area, and then another wall with towers where the archers would all be there. And then on top of that, well, there's another group and a third higher wall. So you could actually get over the first wall and be taken down before you get to the second wall. And there was no way to get ladders up over that second wall, because how do you get them over the first wall without getting killed? And then if you ever managed to get over the second wall, there was a third wall with soldiers. It was just, they said, hey, we're impregnable. It can't happen. This is a fortress that is undefeatable. It begins, every time man gets in that place of braggability, it's just, to me, as I was studying this, I thought, every time man says stuff like that, God just shows him how stupid he is to say that. Wasn't it the declaration of the Titanic? Who just said that? Someone just said it.
I did.
Yeah. What was that, Janet?
I said they tempted God by saying it was unsinkable.
Even God can't sink her.
Yeah.
I think was a statement I've heard. God only used a small little iceberg. But when they analyzed it, it was sinkable. They had flaws in the design that caused it, but they said, well, it could never happen that there would be a rip that long. Well, sure there could be. And whenever man gets that attitude, God humbles them. And isn't this the attitude that Nebuchadnezzar had? We saw in chapter 4. I stood on the roof of the balcony of his son and says, I have brought this beautiful, this is my empire. This is what I have done. And God said, that's it. And that, within 12 months to the day, he was out eating grass. And nobody was listening to him at all. God had made him, went completely insane. And God ran his empire for him for that period of time and then cleaned him up, stuck him back in and said, there. So, how well did you put that together? I could take somebody who's thinks they're a cow eating grass one day and the next I can make them a leader. His point was, I pick them up and I choose the humblest of things and I put them in place. Don't you think that you're anything? I've made you. Brenda?
I'm just wondering how long Nebuchadnezzar was like an animal.
We did that last week.
7 years.
7 years, wasn't it?
7 years.
Yeah, 7 years. God works in sevens.
One period of time.
Yeah, one period of time, seven, yeah. And then, so it was a year after he spoke, and then 7 years, and then boom, he was back up. Yeah, yeah. So it's really, really cool how, and we can think, and remember that we said that this whole book is about man thinking there's something. We live in a world that thinks. I've been listening to, since studying this, I want to be very biblically based, but I want to also be, when I'm presenting to you, very astute or wise to what the world is saying. So I've been listening to stuff I normally wouldn't listen to, like speeches from the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome is made up of a group of elite people who you have to be a former Prime Minister of Canada, like Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau was one. Gorbachev was one of the ones. Henry Kissinger. You have to be an elite person or very, very, very wealthy to be part of the Club of Rome. It's not everybody that's just your average head of state that can be part of the Club of Rome. Anyway, they formed in the 1960s. Well, they're driving this whole thing that the problem with our world today is sustainability. Have you ever heard of that term, sustainability? Well, you're going to hear a lot more of it. And it's going to be driven through the United Nations and sustainable development. The idea is that our world as we know it today is not sustainable. That we cannot take care of. Why? Because there's no God. There's no outside force. There's no. If we don't look after this world, we're going to lose it. So what's causing most of the problems in the world? Well, it's human beings. And they're saying it's consumerism, it's capitalism, it's releasing too much CO2 into the atmosphere, and there's too many human beings living on the planet, so we've got to, number one, we've got to get people out of private ownership, and we've got to collectivize, which is another word for communism, and we need to control things under one stable government that can control. You can see it coming. It's coming down the tubes. It's in nice words, it's in nice phrases, but it's eugenics. It's the control of human beings and who lives and who doesn't live, and how we control the population. Nice things are being said, but if you listen carefully to underlining it, it's the human beings are going to have to take control. And we can do this. We can do this. By the year 2050, we're going to fix this world. He's the head of the Club of Rome. I mean, he's a very elite person, right? And he's saying that he's going to fix it. Well, and the world is desperately looking for, as things get worse and worse, and we're going to see, like the fires of California. They're making fun of Donald Trump now because he's saying, well, this isn't global warming, this is because we haven't taken care of our forests properly, there hasn't been forest management. So, and he's really being attacked for this because they want to really promote the idea that it is global warming, and global warming is going to destroy our world, and we need to arise against this. Now, there's some truth to this because the Bible says in the last days the earth is going to start to fall apart. You don't have to read the Club of Rome. You don't have to read the United Nations report on how the weather's changing. You need to read the book of Revelation. And that says that the world is the book of The book of Romans tells all creation is groaning and straining as a mother in childbirth, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed. It's going to get worse on earth. The weather is going to be more extreme. Jesus said, in the last days, expect there will be earthquakes. Expect there will be an increase in wars and rumors of wars. These nations will rise, ethnic group will rise against ethnic group. Jesus predicted racism. Because when he says nations, he's not talking about countries, he's talking about ethnos. Ethnic groups will rise against ethnic groups. So what we are seeing, you could say, well, the scientists are telling us this and it's frightening, or we can say, the Bible has already told us this is the way it's going to be. So this is the fulfillment of Scripture. And why we study books like Daniel is to see how precise God was with his prophecies that have already been fulfilled. So that we can have faith to say, well, if he was that precise with the prophecies that are already fulfilled, how will he not be more precise or as precise with the prophecies that are yet not fulfilled? So, we have this entitled human being, and his answer to the we're at war and we're losing the empire and we're about to get our head chopped off is, let's all get drunk tonight. Isn't that part of society today too? Party! Party! Eat, drink, be merry, tomorrow we die! Distraction and just entertainment and fun and spend what we have on those things. And if we just had a new car, if we just had a new house, if we just had a new wife, if we just had a new husband, if we just had a new body, oh, there's so many things that, if I just got I know I should get a hair transplant. If I could get a hair transplant, I'd feel so much better about myself. There's, you know what, I can find you an advertisement that'll tell you that. It's society has this answer that man can fix it. Man's cool. Man's good. Now, look at this city. Wasn't it an amazing city at the middle of page 7? It was a beautiful city. And you can see the way it's done. But I want to tell you there was one major flaw, just like the Titanic. They had a major flaw, and that was that they wanted the river to flow through the city. Made it beautiful. Can you imagine walking around the city with the river flowing through it? It must have been so beautiful. I love rivers in the city. I think of the beautiful cities of Europe that I would love to visit someday, like Paris and the Seine running through, or some of those beautiful cities. Be on one of those cruises that go up the rivers, because those rivers used to be the way that things were transported, right? And so you got all the major castles, and it'd be just beautiful to see. Even in the province I grew up in, with all the rivers in Nova Scotia that were used at one time for transportation, and you can travel up those rivers and see beautiful homes along the banks and so on. It's beautiful when a river runs through, and this beautiful river ran right through the heart of Babylon. But what's the problem with putting a river through the middle of your city in regard to defense? It's hard to build walls. You can build walls over it, but you can't block the water. Because if you block, that's called a gate. And if you put a solid gate there, you created a dam. And if you create a dam, the water will flow over you. So to get it to flow through, you have to have bars. So what they did was that they created gates on the river that had bars that went way down, and so nobody could swim down to the bottom and get underneath. So they were safe, no problem. What was done on the night of the attack, and I'm kind of telling you the story behind the story because you have read what's going on. So they're upstairs, they're having a party.
That's right.
And when it all goes off the rails, is that after they've been drinking a while, Belshazzar gets out the golden cups that his great-grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the temple. And these were dedicated to God's glory. You remember the precision to which Moses was to build these things. You remember the precision in which Solomon used to build the temple and the gold. But it was dedicated to the glory of God, the honor of God, even the mug, every little thing. If you go back into our study of Hebrews, like the little tassels at the bottom of the priest's garment, or the way the way the walls were put together, everything meant something. It has a symbol of heaven. It's a picture of God. It speaks of God. It's for the glory of God. And they were bought and paid for a purpose. And when they were used for the defilement, imagine these beautiful things that were meant for bringing glory to God. And he's got, concubines